Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we examine Venezuela's decision to withdraw from the International Criminal Court and what it signals about the country's growing alignment with the United States following the removal of Nicolás Maduro. Across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, we look at the interception of a sophisticated explosive device destined for Northern Ireland, major wildfires across France and Spain, and anti-tourism protests in Mallorca that turned violent. We also assess the Islamic State-inspired attack at Berlin Pride, signs that Russia could be preparing for a large-scale mobilisation later this year, Israel's expanding military operations in the West Bank, and the latest phase of the conflict between the United States and Iran, where attacks are increasingly targeting energy infrastructure and regional shipping. And in Asia-Pacific, we cover severe flooding across China, the arrest of teenagers in Singapore over alleged terrorism offences, and the aftermath of an earthquake in southern Japan. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where Venezuela's decision to withdraw from the International Criminal Court points to an increasingly close relationship with Washington during the country's political transition. On July 24th, Venezuelan government officials announced that the country would withdraw from the International Criminal Court. Venezuelan Foreign Minister Felix Plasencia stated that the decision was motivated by the court's geographical bias, which he said disproportionately targets countries in Africa and Latin America. Venezuelan interim president Delcy Rodriguez reportedly ordered the decision. The U.S. State Department released a message supporting Venezuela's decision, stating that it backs American-led efforts to dismantle the corrupt and worthless ICC. In a statement, the State Department said the ICC had conducted a failed investigation into Nicolás Maduro since 2018. Maduro, the former Venezuelan president, was captured during a U.S. raid in Caracas in January 2026. The statement added that it is time to dismantle the ICC and called on all ICC member states to withdraw from the Rome Statute. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The current U.S. administration has intensified its efforts to oppose the International Criminal Court, particularly after the court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials over the war in Gaza. In February 2025, the United States imposed sanctions on senior ICC officials and has since sought to persuade its partners to withdraw from the Hague-based organization. The decision almost certainly reflects growing U.S. influence over the Venezuelan government, which interim President Delcy Rodriguez has led since the removal of Maduro. While most of Venezuela's leadership has remained in place, the interim government is currently de facto dependent on the United States, with its budget being largely administered from Washington. This dependency has almost certainly deepened following the late June earthquake that caused widespread destruction across Venezuela. The United States has pledged $300 million in relief funding and deployed 2,000 troops to the country. On the same day as the ICC decision, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio announced that negotiations on the post-Maduro political transition will begin in August. The talks will reportedly include both current government figures and opposition leaders, although former presidential candidate Maria Corina Machado is not currently expected to attend. While it is unclear whether the ICC decision was linked to the upcoming political transition, the Rodriguez government likely has an interest in signaling to Washington its willingness to cooperate on key security and geopolitical issues ahead of any major leadership changes. There is a realistic possibility that Venezuela's decision will be followed by other Latin American states that have increasingly aligned their foreign policies with the United States or remain heavily dependent on Washington for economic and security support. Colombia's incoming right-wing president-elect, Abelardo de la Espriella, has pledged to overhaul the country's diplomatic service and has discussed the idea of withdrawing from international organizations such as the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. There is a realistic possibility that either the new Colombian government or those of other states seeking closer relations with the United States will join the Washington-led push against the International Criminal Court. Now, turning to Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, where Irish authorities have intercepted one of the largest explosive devices seized in the country for more than a decade before it could be transported into Northern Ireland. On July 22nd, a vehicle was intercepted on the N2 south of Carrickmacross, County Monaghan, in the province of Ulster, in the Republic of Ireland. The vehicle was stopped as part of an intelligence-led Garda Síochána operation targeting dissident Republican activity. It was transporting a completed explosive device towards the border with Northern Ireland. The device reportedly contained a power unit, a detonator, and military-grade explosives, widely reported to be Semtex. Garda sources described the device as highly sophisticated, ready to be deployed, and, at almost 400 grams, the largest explosive device seized in the Republic of Ireland in at least a decade. Some sources have indicated that the device may have been intended for use as an under-vehicle explosive device in Northern Ireland. A 25-year-old woman, Isabella Perry Sullivan, from Clane, County Kildare, was arrested and later charged with possession of explosives before being granted bail. A man in his 40s was also arrested in Dublin and detained in connection with the possession of explosives. Initial reporting has linked the plot to the new Irish Republican Army, an Irish Republican paramilitary group with an estimated membership of several hundred. Garda Commissioner Justin Kelly described the seizure as extremely significant and confirmed that the device was fully assembled and ready for deployment, rather than being a collection of individual components. Commissioner Kelly stated that it could have caused significant damage and linked the investigation to the continuing threat posed by active dissident Republicans who remain opposed to the 1998 Good Friday Agreement. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The interception of a military-grade explosive device that was almost certainly being transported to Northern Ireland likely indicates that active dissident Republican elements retain both the intent and at least a limited capability to conduct high-profile and potentially lethal attacks in support of their cause. The incident also likely illustrates the vulnerability of the shared international border to the illicit movement of personnel, explosives, and other material following the removal of permanent security checkpoints and other physical border infrastructure as part of the Northern Ireland peace process. While no target has been publicly disclosed, the established targeting patterns of Irish Republican dissident groups likely suggest that the device was most likely intended for use against the police service of Northern Ireland, military personnel, or another security-related target rather than in an indiscriminate attack against civilians. As the device reportedly contained approximately 400 grams of Semtex, its compact size would have been consistent with an under-vehicle explosive device. If successfully deployed, it could still have caused fatal injuries to the intended target and to bystanders, particularly through fragmentation, or if detonated in a densely populated urban area. The reported sophistication of the device and its use of military-grade explosives, widely reported to be Semtex, likely indicate access to experienced bomb makers and to advanced supply chains or legacy stockpiles. Semtex is a highly malleable and relatively stable plastic explosive that is difficult to detect because it is non-metallic, odorless, and easily shaped. The Provisional Irish Republican Army received several tons of Semtex from Libya in the 1980s, and assessments indicate that small quantities may have been concealed, stolen, or transferred to dissident Republican elements before the completion of decommissioning in 2005. Some early assessments indicate that the new IRA was attempting to transport the device into Northern Ireland, believing that Garda counter-terrorism resources were disproportionately focused on policing Ireland's presidency of the Council of the European Union. The group was likely seeking to exploit what it believed was a temporary reduction in surveillance. However, the second suspect was arrested in Dublin during an operation reportedly supported by the PSNI. The operation likely indicates extensive cross-border intelligence sharing and coordinated counter-terrorism activity, with police cooperation almost certainly further bolstered by domestic security and intelligence services on both sides of the border. This level of cross-border and multi-agency cooperation likely suggests that dissident Republican networks remain subject to enhanced surveillance and monitoring, significantly limiting their freedom of movement and reducing their opportunities to conduct successful attacks. According to reporting, sustained police operations have placed significant pressure on the new IRA, culminating in the arrest of members of its leadership, known as the Army Council, in 2020, following a major undercover surveillance operation involving infiltration and covert recordings by an MI5 agent from Scotland. The group subsequently warned that police officers would face reprisals. However, it has largely failed to overcome sustained counter-terrorism pressure, with numerous security operations disrupting new IRA cells and constraining the organization's operational capabilities. In France, firefighters have largely stabilized two major wildfires, but extreme temperatures and persistent hotspots mean the risk is far from over. As of July 30th, two ongoing wildfires in France have triggered the evacuation of more than 250,000 people, mostly from Gironde and Landes, marking the country's largest peacetime evacuation. The Gironde fire, the largest of the current wildfires, started in the village of Somos on July 22nd. It has since burned west of Bordeaux, affecting approximately 42,000 hectares and advancing to within roughly 15 kilometers of the city. The second major wildfire started along Departmental Road 652 and has been burning in the Landes department, immediately south of Gironde. The fire has burned through at least 4,800 hectares of vegetation. So far, the fires have killed 2 firefighters and injured at least 126 others. In a press conference on July 28th, the prefect of the Nouvelle-Aquitaine region declared that the Gironde fire had been stabilized and was no longer continuing to spread. Overall, there were 14 flare-ups, with flames reigniting or intensifying, mostly in areas that had already been affected by the fire. Around 2,750 firefighters are involved in the response, supported by 23 aircraft. By the evening of July 27th, authorities had declared the Landes fire fixed, meaning its forward spread had been stopped, although it had not yet been extinguished. Around 550 firefighters remained mobilized to monitor the perimeter and extinguish residual hotspots. Overall, at least 300 Red Cross volunteers are supporting evacuation efforts and establishing emergency accommodation. Parts of Gironde and Landes recorded air quality ranging from poor to extremely poor, particularly beneath or close to the smoke plume. Authorities have distributed face masks in areas affected by the air pollution. Initially, the smoke was carried towards the Atlantic coast, exposing coastal areas around the Arcachon Basin, northern lands, and Biscarrosse. However, a wind shift from midday on July 29th moved the plume northeastwards, creating a renewed risk of smoke affecting Bordeaux and inland areas of Nouvelle-Aquitaine. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The precise cause of the wildfires remains under investigation, but on July 30th, French police stated that they had arrested 2 people on suspicion of arson. The rapid spread of the wildfires has been attributed to exceptionally dry conditions, combined with repeated heat waves and temperatures approaching 40 degrees Celsius. Low humidity and strong shifting winds have almost certainly accelerated the spread and caused numerous flare-ups, making the fires more difficult for firefighters to contain. At its peak, the Gironde fire produced a pyrocumulonimbus cloud, a type of cloud that forms above an intense heat source and can generate extreme winds, lightning, and further ignitions around the fire perimeter. This is France's first recorded pyrocumulonimbus event, and French officials confirmed that the fire service recorded the cloud's formation approximately 2 days after the fire began. The stabilization of the Gironde and Landes fires has almost certainly reduced the risk of uncontrolled expansion. Despite this, Lieutenant Colonel David Anotel, spokesperson for the National Firefighters Federation of France, has stated that the wildfires could last weeks or even several months. Officials have also warned of a lingering, embedded fire risk, described as a zombie fire, in which vegetation can continue to smolder underground for months. The lack of rainfall is expected to continue through the week as France experiences its fourth heatwave of 2026. Extensive smoldering vegetation, recurring flare-ups, continued high temperatures, low humidity, and shifting winds mean renewed fire growth remains a realistic possibility, particularly along inadequately secured sections of the perimeter. While the wildfires are unlikely to continue spreading at their previous pace, they will likely continue to cause transport disruption and air pollution in the affected areas, while preventing many residents from returning to their homes. Across the border in Spain, authorities continue to battle some of the country's largest wildfires on record, with further flare-ups remaining likely. Wildfires across multiple regions of Spain have triggered the evacuation of approximately 90,000 people, principally in Castilla y León, Madrid, Castilla-La Mancha, and Valencia. The Avila fire, the largest of the current incidents, has burned approximately 50,000 hectares and merged with neighboring fires in Madrid and Toledo into a single fire covering around 80,000 hectares. A second major fire in Guadalajara has affected approximately 35,000 hectares and prompted the evacuation of dozens of settlements, while the Castellón fire has burned around 10,000 hectares, including parts of the Sierra de Espadán Natural Park. The wildfires have killed at least 15 people, while dozens of others have been injured or treated for smoke inhalation. Smoke from the wildfires has worsened air quality, particularly around western Madrid, Avila, Toledo, Guadalajara, and Castellón. Dense smoke has spread into the Madrid metropolitan area, despite the main fire front being approximately 50 kilometers west of the city. Authorities declared a national wildfire emergency, enabling greater central coordination and reinforcement of regional authorities. Approximately 1,200 personnel from the Military Emergencies Unit were deployed alongside regional firefighters. While regional authorities began lifting some evacuation and lockdown orders on July 28, restrictions remain in place in the worst affected areas. As of July 30th, the wildfires are showing signs of improvement, having stabilized overnight. On July 30th, Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez declared that the fires in Avila and Madrid no longer constitute a national emergency. Castellón remains the most active front and is still uncontained after burning close to 25,000 acres. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Although Spain experiences wildfires every year, the Avila fire is the country's largest wildfire since 1961. Notably, the 3 largest wildfires in Spain have all occurred within the past 2 years, with the ongoing Guadalajara fire ranking as the 3rd largest. The 2nd largest wildfire occurred in August 2025 in Larauco, in the northwestern province of Ourense, burning 37,765 hectares of forest. Overall, the 2025 wildfire season burned approximately 382,000 to 393,000 hectares, making it Spain's worst wildfire year since 1994. So far in 2026, approximately 174,000 hectares have burned across Spain, around 6 times the area burned during the same period in 2025. As with the ongoing fires in France, this summer's wildfires have been fueled by dry conditions, repeated heat waves, and strong winds. These conditions have made the fires difficult to extinguish while allowing them to spread rapidly. The situation has been exacerbated by an unusually wet winter, which encouraged vegetation growth before repeated heat waves dried it into abundant fuel. The current heat wave is forecast to last until at least August 2nd. And Spain's state meteorological agency, Agencia Estatal de Meteorología, has warned that the fire danger level will continue to rise to extreme levels, hindering firefighting efforts. The continuing heat wave, dry conditions, and widespread high to extreme fire danger mean renewed fire growth or significant flare-ups remain a realistic possibility. The scale of the evacuations and the proximity of the fires to Madrid demonstrate that Spain's wildfire threat is increasingly affecting densely populated inland areas, rather than just remote or traditionally fire-prone Mediterranean locations. The immediate secondary impacts are likely to include prolonged road closures, disruption to tourism, intermittent deterioration in air quality, and continued restrictions. Also in Spain, anti-tourism demonstrations in Palma de Mallorca have escalated into violence, raising concerns ahead of another planned protest in August. On July 26th, a large-scale anti-tourism protest was held in central Palma de Mallorca. At least 25,000 people attended the demonstration, although protest groups claimed that more than 70,000 people took part. The protest was organized by the Menis Turisme Me Vida movement, alongside dozens of smaller protest groups. In the evening, after the main demonstration had largely dispersed, small groups of activists clashed with police. According to police sources, clashes broke out after approximately 400 activists began attacking tourists and police officers in the Sis Volta area, close to the main port. Officers reportedly fired rubber bullets to disperse the crowd, resulting in multiple injuries and 5 arrests. However, some local media outlets have reported that police rubber bullets also struck bystanders, including tourists. A further protest against the police was held in Palma on July 28th, but did not result in any clashes. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The July 26th protest marks the 3rd consecutive year of large-scale anti-tourism demonstrations in Palma. The first major unrest linked to anti-tourism sentiment on the islands occurred in 2017. However, the movement has grown significantly in popularity since the COVID-19 pandemic, which was followed by a sharp increase in tourist arrivals and in the purchase of second homes on the island by foreign nationals. Local officials have introduced measures to reduce the daily influx of tourists and curb some of the more disruptive forms of tourism in the Balearic Islands. These have included reducing cruise ship dockings, capping hotel capacity, and restricting short-term private apartment rentals. However, anti-tourism activists have largely dismissed these measures as insufficient to address the island's cost of living crisis. In a manifesto released ahead of the July 26th protest, organizers called on the government to stop ignoring social demands and set clear limits that put the needs of the citizens first. The July 26th protest almost certainly represents a significant development. While previous anti-tourism demonstrations had involved episodes of harassment targeting tourists, they had not previously escalated into physical attacks. The Menis Turisme Me Vida movement has presented itself as a non-violent organization. However, there is a realistic possibility that some of its published material could encourage acts of vandalism and other violent forms of direct action. This includes a recently released Action Manual Against Touristification, which features an interactive map geolocating suspected irregular tourist accommodation on the island. It also provides operational advice for activists, including how to avoid CCTV, obscure distinguishing features, and establish escape routes. Tactics promoted by the group have included gluing Airbnb key lockboxes shut and vandalizing businesses linked to tourism. Organizers have scheduled another protest for August 8th in Sóller. In addition to falling at the peak of the tourism season, the weekend of the demonstration is likely to see higher visitor numbers due to the approaching total solar eclipse, which will be visible from northern Spain and the Balearic Islands on August 12th. At present, there is no evidence to indicate that the August 8th protest in Sóller will be coordinated with simultaneous demonstrations elsewhere in Europe. However, Menis Turisme, Mes Vida is part of a wider and increasingly pan-European movement, and there is a realistic possibility that solidarity protests or related actions will be announced in other European tourist destinations at short notice. Meanwhile, Germany is responding to an Islamic State-inspired attack targeting Berlin Pride that has renewed concerns over the threat from self-radicalized extremists. On the evening of July 25th, an individual drove a car into a crowd at a Pride event in the Tiergarten area of central Berlin. The driver reportedly left the vehicle after it crashed into a tree and then attacked bystanders with a bladed weapon. German authorities stated that one person was killed in the attack and 31 others were injured. The attacker, identified as 21-year-old Abdul Bolaut, initially escaped the scene but was shot and killed by responding police in Spandau on July 26th after a 20-hour manhunt. A video recording was discovered on Bolaut's mobile phone in which a masked man, believed to be Bolaut, claimed responsibility for the attack and pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. Bolaut had reportedly been arrested after traveling from Germany to Lebanon in an attempt to join Islamic State in Syria. He was convicted in May 2026 for planning a terrorist attack, but received a suspended sentence after convincing the court that he had distanced himself from the group. Bolaut had also been identified and placed under surveillance from the age of 16 because of his ties to Islamist circles in Berlin. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The attack was highly likely inspired by the ideology of the Islamic State. The group has repeatedly issued propaganda calling on its supporters to attack public events in Europe and North America, and there have been several notable Islamic State-linked attacks targeting Pride events and locations associated with the LGBTQ+ community. These include the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida, the 2022 Oslo Pride shooting, and a thwarted plot targeting a Pride event in Vienna in 2023. Individuals who espouse Islamic State ideology almost certainly retain an interest in targeting Pride events because of their high visibility and symbolic value. Official Islamic State media has not publicly claimed the attack. However, observers have noted that Islamic State supporters online have celebrated the attack and claimed that the attacker was an Islamic State militant. This almost certainly reflects a broader shift in the way the group approaches lone actor attacks. In recent years, Islamic State has largely refrained from claiming responsibility for or directing individual attacks. However, through its official channels, it has repeatedly stated that attackers who pledge allegiance to the group should nevertheless be considered Islamic State fighters, even in the absence of an official claim. This approach is almost certainly intended to lower the threshold for affiliation with the group and reinforce its ideological monopoly over this type of attack in Western countries. The absence of hierarchical direction also likely provides an operational advantage by limiting links between lone actors and the wider organization, reducing the likelihood that other members will be identified, investigated, or detained following an attack. Bolaut's previous conviction for planning a terrorist attack, his suspended sentence, and his long-standing identification as an Islamist threat will almost certainly place the German authorities under significant pressure over their handling of the case. The incident has clear parallels with the December 2016 Berlin Christmas market attack. Its perpetrator, Anis Amri, was also a known Islamist extremist who had previously been monitored before surveillance was discontinued, prompting extensive criticism of intelligence coordination, threat prioritization, and the authorities' failure to prevent an attack by an identified high-risk individual. Far-right and anti-immigration political actors will likely exploit the case to reinforce claims that Germany's counter-terrorism and integration policies are failing, increasing the likelihood of anti-immigration demonstrations and renewed political debate over surveillance, sentencing, and immigration controls. There is a realistic possibility that the attack will inspire copycat actions by other self-radicalized individuals in Europe, and possibly in the United States. There is a remote possibility that a stabbing in Paris on July 27th, which injured 3 women, was partially inspired by the Berlin attack. In Ukraine, new legislative measures in Russia suggest the Kremlin could be preparing for a large-scale mobilization after September's elections. On July 27th, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky warned that intelligence indicates Russian President Vladimir Putin intends to launch a new wave of involuntary mobilization following Russia's State Duma elections scheduled for mid-September. Zelensky stated that Putin aims to draft between 300,000 and 500,000 personnel, with the call-up likely to begin in October. A series of recent legislative measures potentially indicate that the Kremlin has set the conditions to enable a mobilization. On July 22nd, the State Duma approved a law expanding contract eligibility to Russians with active criminal records, including defendants currently facing charges during formal mobilization periods. On July 26th, Putin signed a law expanding the Ministry of Defense's and the National Guard's access to personal data on military personnel and their families held in the state civil registry. This followed a Rosgvardia proposal on July 21st to expand its civil defense powers to protect Russian society from unspecified dangers during mobilization, martial law, and wartime. Earlier, in November 2025, Putin had already signed a law permitting the deployment of reservists to combat zones without a formal declaration of mobilization. An opposition Russian outlet reported on July 28th, citing sources in and close to the government, that Kremlin-linked officials are discussing the introduction of martial law, or elements of it, along with associated restrictions. These reportedly include tighter currency and foreign asset controls, restrictions on virtual private networks, and the introduction of exit visas. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. While President Zelensky's public warning was almost certainly intended, in part, to reinforce Kiev's appeals for continued Western support, the Kremlin has highly likely established the conditions for a potential mobilization in autumn 2026. Many of the administrative and legal requirements for a large-scale call-up are now likely in place. Russia maintains a comprehensive electronic conscription registry, has shifted to a year-round conscription cycle, has progressively expanded the pool of recruitable convicts, and can already conduct rolling partial reserve call-ups under the November 2025 legislation without a formal declaration. President Putin has been widely reported as setting an objective for the Russian armed forces to seize the remainder of unoccupied Donetsk Oblast, including its highly defensible fortress belt, by the end of 2026. However, despite increasing Russian infiltrations into the fortress belt city of Kostiantynivka, this objective is highly unlikely to be achieved within the desired timeframe. Based on figures provided by President Zelensky, Russian forces sustained approximately 222,500 casualties between January and July 2026, while recruiting only around 221,000 personnel over the same period. Although a large-scale mobilization would almost certainly generate considerable civil discontent, the Kremlin likely assesses that it is necessary to sustain its manpower advantage and pursue its maximalist objectives on the battlefield. The claimed timing of a potential mobilization after the mid-September State Duma elections is highly likely to be driven by the political sensitivity of an expanded call-up. Russia's September 2022 mobilization of approximately 300,000 reservists triggered protests and a large-scale exodus of military-age men, after which President Putin avoided further nationwide mobilizations. Putin would therefore likely defer any new mobilization until after the elections to minimize the risk of political and electoral disruption. In 2022, martial law measures followed approximately 1 month after the mobilization announcement, and recent legislative activity almost certainly indicates that the Kremlin is preparing for a comparable domestic backlash. The immediate impact of a large-scale Russian mobilization would likely be limited. Many of those called up would likely have limited or outdated military experience and would require training, equipment, and integration into existing units before deployment. In addition, personnel could be dispersed across a front stretching more than 1,000 kilometers. However, sufficiently large formations could be concentrated on selected axes to support a tactical breakthrough, reinforce depleted assault units, expand pressure across multiple sectors, and shape conditions for larger offensives in the spring of 2027. Additional manpower could also enable Russian commanders to rotate exhausted troops more frequently, strengthen defensive positions, absorb continued losses, and free more experienced personnel for lateral redeployment to other sectors of the front. Turning to the Middle East, Israel is expanding military operations across the West Bank following a deadly firefight near Nablus. On the morning of July 24th, a firefight broke out in the West Bank village of Tel, near Nablus, resulting in the deaths of 4 Palestinians and 2 Israelis. The shooting reportedly occurred after armed Israeli settlers entered the village, which is located in the Palestinian Authority-controlled Area A of the West Bank, leading to a confrontation near a local mosque. After Israeli civil defense teams arrived at the scene, a Palestinian reportedly seized one of the officers' weapons, triggering the shootout. In response to the incident, Israeli officials called for operations targeting local villages, deployed additional Israel Defense Forces units to the area, and imposed a curfew. Israel Defense Forces channels stated that they are planning a major counter-terrorism operation in the West Bank. Israeli troops subsequently carried out operations in Ramallah, Tulkarm, Nablus, and other areas across the West Bank. On July 28, Palestinian sources stated that Israeli forces had arrested at least 20 people during the operations. On the same day, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz stated that he had ordered an expanded West Bank offensive and the seizure of an undisclosed refugee camp. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Israeli military activity in the West Bank has intensified since the start of 2026, particularly following the outbreak of the US-Iran war in late February. This escalation has likely been driven, in part, by an increase in settler violence, which has highly likely been emboldened by the current Israeli government's plans to expand both the number and geographical scope of settlements in the West Bank. According to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 87 Palestinians had been killed in the West Bank as of July 27th, including 21 during confrontations involving settlers. Since October 7, 2023, Israeli operations in the West Bank have almost certainly been aimed at preventing the territory from emerging as an additional front in Israel's conflict with the Iran-led so-called Axis of Resistance. The 12-day war in 2025 and the more recent 2026 Iran war have likely allowed Israeli officials to intensify military operations in the West Bank by diverting international attention and helping to reinforce the narrative that Palestinian armed groups in the territory form part of the wider Iran-led threat to Israel. During the ongoing negotiations, Iranian officials have largely refrained from discussing Palestine, instead prioritizing the conflict in Lebanon and the survivability of Hezbollah. This likely reflects Iranian assessments that militant groups in Gaza and the West Bank have already been sufficiently degraded and can no longer be leveraged as a deterrent against Israel. Moreover, sustained Israel Defense Forces operations in the Palestinian territories have imposed diplomatic and political costs on Israel, contributing to a decline in international support. Expanded Israel Defense Forces operations in the West Bank have often been followed by attacks in Israel or against Israeli targets in the territory, including shootings, stabbings, and vehicle ramming incidents. An expanded offensive, or the seizure of a refugee camp, is likely to increase the risk of retaliatory attacks, particularly at security checkpoints, settlement entrances, public transport hubs, and other locations where security personnel or civilians are concentrated. Elsewhere in the region, Iran is increasingly relying on proxy groups to target regional energy infrastructure and shipping, despite a temporary pause in direct U.S. strikes. On July 24th, U.S. President Donald Trump reportedly ordered the military to halt strikes against Iran. The directive followed U.S. Central Command's 13th consecutive night of attacks and was issued several hours after an Omani delegation arrived in Tehran for talks on arrangements to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Oman's proposal reportedly includes a jointly managed Mallorca-style system with voluntary navigation fees and a 3-lane traffic scheme designed to prevent unilateral Iranian control. Later on July 24th, President Trump told reporters that while the U.S. retained the option to continue or escalate strikes, he assessed that making a deal was the smarter strategy. However, Trump also indicated that he did not believe Iran was currently ready to make a deal. On July 27th, President Trump told U.S. media that if talks with Iran did not succeed, the U.S. would return to military action. He also indicated that he would give diplomacy only a limited period to produce an agreement. Iranian officials stated on July 26th that Iran would refrain from direct attacks, provided the U.S. maintained its operational pause. However, on July 27th and 28th, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Bahrain, Iraq, and Israel reported intercepting attack drones, and at least one projectile struck Saudi Arabia's Abqaiq oil processing facility in the eastern province. The Houthis claimed responsibility for the attack on the Abqaiq facility. However, Saudi Arabia attributed it to Iranian-backed militant groups in Iraq. On July 28th, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia conducted joint strikes targeting militant weapons caches and logistics nodes in Iraq. U.S. Central Command claimed that the strikes followed more than 30 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps-directed drone attacks against U.S. forces and Saudi energy infrastructure during the preceding 72 hours. Iraq's Popular Mobilization Forces reported that at least 20 of their members had been killed in the joint U.S.-Saudi strikes. On July 28th, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched ballistic missiles towards U.S. forces at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, where U.S. service personnel had recently been killed. U.S. Central Command stated that Iran had attempted a surprise attack, but that all the missiles were intercepted. On July 29th, U.S. Central Command conducted a series of retaliatory strikes across Iran, targeting command and control nodes, missile and drone facilities, coastal surveillance, and air defense assets, and other military capabilities. On July 29th, 2 tankers sustained damage after one was reportedly struck by an attack drone in the Egyptian port of Damietta. A U.S.-owned floating storage and regasification unit was reportedly hit and set ablaze, while a Greek-owned tanker berthed alongside it also caught fire. Iran has not officially claimed responsibility for the attack. However, Iranian officials have stated that it was a drone strike and that it demonstrated Iran's intent to escalate the conflict and expand the disruption of global shipping and energy supplies. Further, Iranian ballistic missiles were launched against U.S. military targets in Jordan on July 30th. However, all the projectiles were reportedly intercepted. Kuwait's Ministry of Defense stated on July 30th that an Iranian missile strike hit a building belonging to a Chinese company in northern Kuwait, killing one worker and causing extensive material damage. The identity of the company was not disclosed. Now our intelligence team's assessment. The 13 consecutive days of U.S. strikes on Iran that preceded the temporary pause were likely intended to demonstrate the U.S.'s ability to sustain high-intensity operations, further degrade Iranian military and logistical capabilities, and weaken Tehran's resolve to continue the conflict. However, Iran's response has likely been calibrated to convey that sustained U.S. military pressure will not compel it to capitulate to U.S. demands. By combining direct Iranian missile and drone attacks with proxy operations, Iran is likely signaling that it retains sufficient military depth and regional reach to continue imposing costs on the U.S. and its allies. During the 13 days of U.S. strikes, most attacks against regional states were carried out by Iranian proxy groups rather than through direct Iranian action. This strategy likely enabled Iran to maintain a degree of plausible deniability while sustaining pressure on regional governments, imposing military and economic costs, and undermining confidence in U.S. security guarantees. By demonstrating that U.S. partners remained exposed despite the presence of substantial U.S. military assets and the ongoing high-intensity strikes, Iran likely sought to encourage regional states to distance themselves from Washington's campaign and press the U.S. towards negotiations. Attacks on Saudi Arabia follow several recent escalations between Riyadh and the Houthis. The use of Iraqi-based militant groups to target Saudi energy infrastructure aligns with Tehran's wider objective of disrupting energy supplies, but it likely also served additional operational objectives. Attacks originating from Iraq threatened Saudi Arabia with a northern attack axis, alongside the established attack routes from Iran and Houthi-controlled Yemen. A renewed northern attack axis would likely force Saudi Arabia to disperse aircraft, radar, and air defense systems across multiple directions, potentially overstretching its air defenses and exposing gaps in coverage. By increasing Saudi Arabia's vulnerability to coordinated attacks from the north, east, and south, Iran likely also sought to restore deterrence against further Saudi strikes on Houthi-controlled Yemen. Saudi strikes on Iranian-backed militants in Iraq were likely intended to deter further attacks and prevent the northern attack axis from becoming an established attack vector. The direct ballistic missile attack against U.S. forces at Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan on July 17th represented a departure from this proxy-led strategy. U.S. Central Command described it as an attempted surprise attack, despite Iran having targeted the facility with ballistic missiles on numerous previous occasions. Several days of dispersed drone attacks from Iraq and Yemen likely conditioned U.S. and regional air defenses to prioritize slower, lower-altitude threats, approaching from established proxy launch areas. Iran may have sought to exploit this pattern by switching to ballistic missiles launched directly from Iranian territory, which would likely have reduced warning times and forced defenders to transition rapidly to counter a much faster, higher-altitude threat. As Iran expends its ballistic missile stockpile and U.S. strikes continue to degrade its missile capabilities, there is a realistic possibility that this could become an established Iranian tactic designed to maximize the effectiveness of a smaller number of missiles. Manos! The attack on a U.S.-owned vessel in Damietta, Egypt, has yet to be officially attributed to Iran or an Iranian-aligned group. However, it follows the resumption of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. While a drone launched from Houthi-controlled Yemen could reach northern Egypt by traveling largely over the Red Sea, reducing its exposure to detection and interception. While Iran or its proxy forces have limited capability to target vessels underway in the Mediterranean Sea, stationary vessels in port that are within range can be targeted by attack drones using pre-programmed coordinates without requiring persistent surveillance or terminal guidance against a moving target. There is a realistic possibility that Iran and its proxies will conduct further strikes against shipping outside the immediate conflict zone. Such attacks, particularly if they target vessels transporting energy products, could increase insurance and freight costs, demonstrate Tehran's ability to impose economic costs well beyond the Gulf, and further disrupt global energy supplies at a time when Iran is already restricting passage through the Strait of Hormuz and threatening shipping in the Bab al-Mandeb and Red Sea. There have been conflicting reports regarding Iran's willingness to accept the Omani proposal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Tehran is likely using ambiguity over its position to preserve negotiating leverage, avoid appearing to concede under U.S. military pressure, and test whether Washington and regional states are prepared to recognize a continued Iranian role in regulating passage through the choke point. Control of the Strait of Hormuz likely remains Iran's central war aim, as Tehran likely assesses that control of the strait is its most reliable source of long-term leverage. Agreeing to any deal that diluted Iranian control would likely require substantial concessions in return, such as significant sanctions relief. Moreover, any deal agreed by the civilian government would also require the support of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which retains substantial control over Iran's maritime operations and has consistently opposed arrangements that undermine Iranian control. If the current talks fail to make meaningful progress, further cycles of escalation are highly likely in the short term. These will likely involve proxy attacks on regional energy infrastructure and U.S. bases, direct Iranian strikes against U.S. military assets, attacks on shipping, and potentially a broader campaign targeting critical national infrastructure. Now shifting to Asia-Pacific, severe flooding across multiple provinces in China continues to cause widespread disruption as the cyclone season gathers pace. Since July 25th, heavy rainfall has resulted in flash flooding, landslides, and widespread transport disruption across several provinces in northwestern, central, and southern China. On July 26th, in Weiyuan County, Gansu Province, a flash flood in a scenic area killed at least 10 people and injured 23 others. Several of the victims were reportedly tourists camping close to a river when water levels rose rapidly. In southern China, on July 26th, Typhoon Noel made landfall in Huidong County, Guangdong Province, bringing strong winds and heavy rainfall. More than 800,000 people were evacuated across Guangdong, while hundreds of flights and rail services were cancelled throughout southern China and Hong Kong. At least 21 people were injured in Hong Kong. Heavy rainfall has also increased the risk of further flooding and landslides across Guangdong, Fujian, Jiangxi, Hunan, Hubei, Henan, and Guangxi, prompting the authorities to issue weather alerts. Hundreds of rivers have exceeded warning levels during the wider period of heavy rainfall, while roads, railways, and local power networks have been disrupted. The latest flooding follows several other deadly weather events during July, including flooding in Guangxi and a rain-triggered landslide in Chongqing. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. Further flooding, landslides, and transport disruption are highly likely across southern, central, and eastern China over the coming weeks. Sustained heavy rainfall has almost certainly saturated the ground and raised river and reservoir levels, creating conditions in which further rainfall, including from weaker tropical storms, is likely to trigger additional flash floods, slope failures, and localized infrastructure damage. Mountainous areas, river valleys, and communities downstream of reservoirs will remain particularly exposed. The repeated impact of tropical systems during 2026 indicates an active cyclone season in the northwestern Pacific. Developing El Niño conditions typically shift cyclone formation farther east and southeast, allowing some storms to remain over warm water for longer and potentially strengthen before approaching East Asia. This pattern can increase cyclone exposure in Taiwan, the Ryukyu Islands, Japan, and the Korean Peninsula, as well as parts of eastern China, including Fujian, Zhejiang, and the Shanghai region, which are likely to be more exposed to cyclones than during non-El Niño years. However, even storms that do not make direct landfall in China can potentially bring heavy rainfall, storm surges, and damaging winds, especially in coastal provinces. Further short-notice evacuations, flight and rail cancellations, port closures, and road disruption are likely throughout the remainder of the typhoon season. Flooding and high winds are also likely to result in intermittent power and telecommunications outages, along with further transport disruption. South China is likely to be comparatively less exposed than parts of eastern China under El Niño conditions. In Singapore, the arrest of 3 teenagers under counter-terrorism legislation highlights growing concerns over online radicalization. On July 27, Singaporean officials stated that 3 teenagers, aged 14, 15 and 19, had been detained under the Internal Security Act between April and June after becoming self-radicalized online and planning unrelated attacks. The 14-year-old suspect reportedly intended to carry out a mass stabbing at his secondary school. He had drafted a 21-page manifesto, selected non-Muslim teachers and students as targets, identified knives from his home, and planned to live-stream the attack before killing himself. The other teenagers separately considered pressure cooker bomb attacks and knife attacks targeting Singapore Armed Forces personnel and LGBTQ students. All 3 suspects had been partially inspired by Islamic State content. However, the 14-year-old suspect was also strongly influenced by mass shooters and far-right content. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. In July 2025, Singapore's Internal Security Department published the Singapore Terrorism Threat Assessment Report 2025, an annual assessment of the domestic and regional terrorism threat, radicalization trends, and Singapore's preparedness measures. The 2025 report concluded that the terrorism threat to Singapore remained high, although there was no publicly identified imminent attack and no major terrorist attack on Singaporean soil since the 1991 hijacking of Singapore Airlines Flight SQ117. However, Singapore has thwarted numerous attacks and continues to assess that, because of its close relationships with Western countries, prominent landmarks, international profile, and secular multicultural character, it remains a coveted target for transnational violent extremist organizations espousing Islamist beliefs. The report assessed that Islamic State remains the primary external ideological and regional threat, while Al-Qaeda continues to pose a lower but persistent threat. The report also concluded that the primary domestic threat stemmed from online self-radicalization, particularly among teenagers and young adults. It also assessed that foreign nationals working in Singapore were highly vulnerable to radicalization and were being targeted not only to conduct attacks, but also to facilitate financing and recruitment. The authorities further warned that overseas conflicts, primarily the Israel-Palestine conflict, combined with the growing use of artificial intelligence, had increased the volume, accessibility, and sophistication of extremist propaganda, likely accelerating radicalization. While Singapore's terrorism threat remains low by international standards, the authorities have warned that they cannot guarantee every plot will be detected and disrupted. Public vigilance, early reporting, and preparedness therefore remain central to the country's counter-terrorism strategy. The threat is also likely to increase as emerging technologies make extremist propaganda, recruitment, and attack planning more accessible, and as young people continue to amalgamate material drawn from contradictory ideologies, including Islamist extremism, far-right narratives, and mass shooter subcultures, into highly personalized justifications for violence. Violent extremist organizations will almost certainly continue to view Singapore as an attractive target. Its long absence of a successful attack, international profile, and high concentration of symbolic targets mean that even a relatively unsophisticated incident would deliver significant propaganda value. And finally, authorities in Japan are continuing recovery efforts after a shallow earthquake struck western Kyushu, with aftershocks expected in the coming days. On July 28, 2026, At approximately 4:27 p.m. Japan Standard Time, a powerful shallow earthquake struck southern Kumamoto Prefecture on Kyushu. The Japan Meteorological Agency assessed the earthquake at magnitude 7.1 and a depth of approximately 10 kilometers, while the United States Geological Survey recorded a magnitude of 6.8. Strong shaking was reported across Kumamoto, Nagasaki, and neighboring parts of Kyushu. A tsunami advisory was issued for the Ariake and Yatsushiro seas, but was subsequently lifted. As of July 30th, more than 100 aftershocks had been recorded in the area. At least 34 people have died and dozens have been injured, while several others remain missing or trapped in collapsed buildings. Rescue operations are continuing at several locations, including a badly damaged shopping center in Kashima and an industrial facility. More than 9,000 people have relocated to approximately 500 evacuation shelters. The earthquake caused extensive localized damage to homes, roads, and commercial buildings. A freight train derailed at Yatsushiro Station. Parts of the Kyushu Expressway and several local flyovers were damaged, and Kumamoto Castle sustained structural damage. As of July 30th, approximately 23,000 households remained without electricity and 9,500 without gas, while telecommunications services were unavailable in some areas. Rail and Shinkansen services were suspended across affected parts of Kyushu, while operations at Kumamoto Airport and some regional flights remained disrupted. Authorities issued evacuation instructions in parts of Kumamoto and Nagasaki prefectures. No abnormalities have been reported at regional nuclear power plants. Now our intelligence team's assessment. Japan's disaster resilience, including strict building standards, seismic retrofitting, early warning systems, and well-developed emergency services, has highly likely limited the overall infrastructure damage and casualty toll. Shinkansen trains, for example, are equipped with seismic sensors that automatically initiate emergency braking when strong shaking is detected. However, in 2016, Kumamoto experienced a series of earthquakes that resulted in nearly 300 direct and indirect fatalities and caused extensive damage to homes, roads, bridges, and other critical infrastructure. This indicates that, even in highly resilient environments, shallow earthquakes and repeated strong aftershocks can still cause significant casualties and prolong disruption, particularly where buildings have already been weakened and transport networks have been damaged. Further aftershocks are highly likely over the coming days. Although most will highly likely be weaker than the initial earthquake, additional magnitude 5.0 or stronger tremors remain possible. These could cause weakened structures to collapse, trigger landslides in mountainous areas, and disrupt rescue operations. Transport disruption is likely to persist for several days. Rail services have begun to gradually resume following safety inspections, but damage to tracks, stations, signaling equipment, and rolling stock has resulted in localized suspensions and delays, which are likely to continue in the short term. Flights have largely returned to normal, with Kumamoto Airport confirmed to be undamaged and operations substantively restored since July 29th, although some routes remain on reduced or adjusted schedules. Damage to bridges, flyovers, and landslide-prone roads will also increase journey times and impede relief operations. Power, gas, and telecommunications services will likely be restored progressively. However, intermittent outages, mobile network congestion, and pressure on evacuation shelters remain likely, particularly in the most heavily affected areas and following further aftershocks. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solaceglobal.com. Thank you for listening.